Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. I am very pleased to have on with me as a guest Tommy Schultz from the American Federation for Children, AFC. We are just about a day after the announcement came that Donald Trump had appointed Linda McMahon to become the new Secretary of Education. And of course, he had a great relationship with Betsy DeVos in the first Trump term. Linda McMahon, I think, kind of cut from the same cloth in terms of direction and in terms of stick-to-itiveness, let's just say. And Tommy, I know that you have a lot of really good thoughts about what to do with the Department of Education. As you know, and I was just telling you this, I've been joking around saying they should appoint me to it because I'd have always wanted to fire myself. And we could call it the Department of Ed for a while, and that would be actually kind of cool. But they chose Linda McMahon, and I think it's a good choice if what Donald Trump wants is to unwind the Department of Education. And I suspect that that's what this is about.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, a really interesting selection. I think she's going to be a great champion for not only the president's priorities, but for families, really. I think at the end of the day, when you saw in Trump's announcement that she is going to be a bold advocate for choice in every state. I mean, that's what he said right in his kind of first paragraph of the statement. She's going to fight to send education back to the states. Really, priority number one is school choice. We worked with Linda McMahon and her team at the America First Policy Institute to pass school choice legislation the last 3 years across a dozen states together. You look at that momentum, you look at the big electoral victories that happened in Texas, you look at this mandate that Trump has going into the election and his selection of an absolute school choice champion. I think really big things are ahead because legislatively, if you pass priority number one, which is school choice, a federal tax credit scholarship that gives all 50 states access to scholarship money at a level that we have never seen before, that is, priority one, game, set, and match. The teachers union's power is going to be severely degraded. You then, when you're talking about the Department of Ed, not Department of Ed that you run, unfortunately, but when you talk about what you could do then mechanically, the real blueprint is think of the big ticket items at the Department of Education. What do? They have a $1.7 trillion student loan portfolio. If you look at the assets of the biggest banks in America, that's basically like the fifth biggest bank in America. It's just absolutely astounding. So if you actually shift all that over to the Department of Treasury, much better situation. There will be real accountability for taxpayers when it comes to the student loan dynamics. The Federal Department of Education just failed its third audit. It's just staggering that this thing continues to exist. It shouldn't exist. You can then go piece by piece on these other big items, like there's about $30 billion that goes to K through 12 dynamics, whether it's Title I for kind of lower income students, some special needs dynamics. You could shift that all down to the states. The states can handle that. There's no reason to have federal, taxpayers pay the feds, and then that goes right back to the states for all these different complicated pots. Why have this middleman? So when you kind of go piece by piece like that, the Department of Education is brought down to the studs. And then I think legislatively, lawmakers in Congress, they'll go, hey, I think we can just kind of do away with things after we get those really big ticket items shifted over into different pots. But school choice, that's got to be number one priority first.
Tommy, I agree with you. School choice, I think, is a civil rights issue, especially in urban areas where
Absolutely.
Schools are just failing, right? And they're, these parents are locked into monopolies. If they're not independently wealthy, they're certainly not going to be able to get their kids into alternative schools where they could actually get a better education. And right. I think market dynamics is a great way to improve public schools as well as, open up new opportunities for private schools. Once you create that demand, you will get providers that will come to the market to fill it. And you will get a wide variety of education experiences, and parents can choose what they want for themselves. Now, that's been stymied because you mentioned the teachers unions. So I think that you're right. I think that emphasis is a good starting point emphasis, but let's get to the basics here, which is that the federal government really doesn't have a constitutional authority to be in this market in the first place, right? This is really constitutionally speaking, there's really no route for the federal government to be even involved in education, spending dime one. And ever since Reagan, well, ever since the Department of Education was established under Jimmy Carter, Reagan and other Republicans have been saying we need to unwind this. This is not a federal issue. It needs to go back to the states and to the localities. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this is because what happened in Virginia 3 years ago, right? You had parents going to school boards to complain about, critical race theory being, infiltrated into curricula against parents' wishes. And the Department of Justice treated them like domestic terrorists for showing up at school board meetings. And that's what it's actually supposed to be like. That's what education policy is supposed to be like. It's supposed to be in the individual communities with parents involved, with elected officials to shape their children's education. I don't think you get out of that unless you just simply get the federal government entirely out of education. And so, first off, I'd like to know what the AFC position is on that. I'm pretty sure you're sympathetic to that viewpoint, but how do you accomplish it? How do you take what's already 45-year-old federal department and unwind it? Do you do it through a process of dropping it down to block granting to states and then just simply sort of eliminate it? Does Congress really have to be the driver on this? These are all really interesting questions that McMahon's appointment sort of opens up.
Correct. Yeah. So lots to unpack there. I mean, when you're talking about kind of the constitutional nexus here, and how this like creature kind of came about in the the late 1970s, even the Washington Post, I posted an article that they wrote in like I think 1978, an op-ed, an editorial, talking about how they're like, look, the teachers unions have had unbelievable sway over our education system, building out this department. These are the Washington Post words, right? They said building out this department, it's just going to be a new thing for this creature, and they're this creature that we are creating, frankly. Their support base is the unions. That's going to be their primary customer. It won't be the parents. Like you said, it won't be about local control. You're just federalizing more and more of education, which, the founders clearly didn't intend that. I mean, some of the early founders even wrote about this, talking about, different dynamics around federal monies going to education. They say, look, that's not how this should operate. So that being said, we're going to have to unwind this. The department shouldn't exist. I think everybody essentially agrees on that. And it's failed at its own stated mission for the past 40 years, essentially. When you look at these student outcomes on reading and math, I mean, we're basically flat since the 1970s. So trillions of dollars that we've spent on K through 12 education just essentially down the drain. So mechanically, you asked about kind of how you do this. Again, major big functions where the feds really serve a huge role. I talked about student loans. That's big dollars, 1.7 trillion sitting on the books. Put that over in Treasury. Office of Civil Rights. This is can be a pretty nefarious actor, and the Obama administration really was the kind of starting gun for this, of utilizing this office along with a few other offices to influence or mandate things, tie strings into things when it comes to federal piece of legislation, like everything from No Child Left Behind, even up to kind of the 2008 big stimulus package kind of things, race to the top. A lot of ways that they put federal strings into money that went to the states, right? So if you put Office of Civil Rights just over the Department of Justice, they already have a civil rights division. Even the special needs stuff, a lot of parents are getting worried about, well, if you enter the Department of Education, what happens to my students, Individuals with Disabilities Act rights? What happens there? Well, Health and Human Services already has a division around students with disabilities. They can handle this. So you're really taking out these duplicative things from the Department of Education, which wields really big political power. Kind of the saying goes that while the federal department only controls about 10% of funds that go to K through 12, it's probably 90% of the paperwork or 90% of the regulation. So if you take a number of these big regulatory nefarious actors within the department, shift them around, you're really neutering its impact. And then when you think about, there's probably 4,400 employees there. Many of them you're looking at, Lord only knows what they're doing. Those, I'm sure, 4,400 employees, when they have really no nexus, no perch, no power, I'm sure they're going to walk just, a few blocks down the road to the National Education Association, the teachers unions, and probably get new jobs over there. So at the end of the day, when you're talking about Congress, to actually undo a cabinet level agency, it will require legislation. So I think, though, when you can move some of these things around with some agency actions, some executive orders, and then you kind of the coup de grace of the the congressional piece of movement, again, that's how you sort of do it systemically, do it quickly. That's really the blue plan. I mean, a lot of folks are just saying, the block grant mechanism, yes, you can do that with some of these federal pots of money that do flow to the states. That's a piece of it for sure, but it's not the end game. You got to really kind of finish off this other stuff. And that's not even, we're not even talking about, Ed, the higher ed money. I mean, tons of federal research money, all these different things. Again, you can send or delegate that back down to the states or end some of these kind of duplicative or frankly, sometimes nefarious pots of money where the feds are controlling the strings.
So a couple things about that. First off, I have to admit, I'm old enough to remember when this used to be called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, before they broke out education, before they broke out HHS.
Right.
The argument at the time was health, education, and welfare. None of those things actually should be federal priorities or federal jurisdictions, right? It's sort of like the old joke about the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. That really should be a convenience store, not a federal agency. That's a different topic for another time. Tommy and AFC take no position on that. I'm just having a little bit of fun here. So the reason why I bring this up is because the federal involvement in education policy didn't begin in 1979, and it didn't begin with Jimmy Carter. He just crystallized it into its own separate cabinet level department for political purposes. I get what the politics of that were, but it was a bad idea. It was a bad move. And I mean, the performance of education since that time, it may be more correlative than causative, but let's just say that the decline in American education hasn't been arrested by making this a department level federal agency and basically federalizing control of education through curriculum, demands, through mandates, through the use of federal money to influence decisions by local school boards and states. I mean, it's really just been a disaster. It's corrupted the whole process. So, but I do want to get to the higher education thing, because this is what I actually been writing most about, right? We write about school choice, which would be greatly helped if the federal government would get out of the way. But the higher education is sort of the whole thing in a microcosm, right? There's a bunch of federal money that flows into this. It corrupts the market for this. It removes pricing signals. The student loan program is one of the worst things that we ever did because it saddles people with enormous debt. And the reason why it's enormous debt is because the spigot of money keeps increasing demand irrationally in a market and prices go up to match it. And now you've got people coming out of colleges with $200,000 worth of lifetime debt. For an education that is never going to have the type of return on investment that makes that work, unless you're unless you're an Ivy League lawyer or a doctor, you're never going to make that money back up. And I mean, that's almost criminal. And my feeling on this is that, especially after all the unrest in the past year that we've seen at these what I've been calling the poison ivies, is that the best thing to do is just to cut off all federal money altogether. Doesn't matter. You don't even need to put a mandate on. In fact, you remove the mandates on the universities. They just get rid of them. Get rid of the money, get rid of the mandates. Let them do what they want to do, but restore full pricing signals to universities and colleges so that the consumers can make up their own mind as to whether or not they think it's worth it and whether or not they actually have the resources to be able to purchase that education, or maybe they should go to something less expensive, but more worthwhile, like trade schools. We're not allowing them to make rational decisions because we've made the market entirely irrational. And I mean, that's a market-based argument, but I think it's solid. And I think that that's it's got to be one of the priorities here. And maybe that's a little outside your normal scope, but I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Sure. No, it's definitely not in the day-to-day of our work at AFC, kind of passing school choice legislation, but I'll give you some, perspective. Think about, everything you talked about, which, how we took student loans into this really radically different direction only in the last 15 or so years. I believe it was in 2010, essentially, that they really federalized the student loan process. And you look at just how, again, early 2000s, you maybe had a couple $100 billion or worth of, student loans going out there. Private actors kind of actually engaging in this marketplace. Then they federalized it probably to, pay for Obamacare. It was a kind of a wild turn of events. They said, doing this will allow us to kind of allow for the pay for the Obamacare, various mandates, extra expenses. What's funny, though, is that when you look at now that it's gone from a couple $100 billion to now nearly $2 trillion all of a sudden, and, they're having to do these accounting gimmicks to say that it actually makes money. The federal watchdogs that have investigated this says they're actually losing money on these student loan, dynamics. And you throw in when they're quote unquote canceling loans, which is just shifting the loan balance to other federal taxpayers, many of whom didn't even go to college. It's a totally distorted marketplace, as you said. So if you get student loans at least out of the Department of Education, put it over in Treasury, enable private lending, you can actually then introduce some other mechanisms out there. And this, again, not my area, but think of where you actually have colleges that are more held on the hook for the fact that, like, let's say you give somebody this massive or unsecured loan, and you're giving it to a 17 or 18-year-old, you actually can say, no, hey, we're going to actually do an income share agreement, different sorts of mechanisms that actually make a little bit more market sense, both for, what you talked about in terms of pricing transparency, let alone actual outcome-based, movements, versus if you're just saying, hey, we're going to give you this big loan. It's going to saddle you up for a lifetime. They created the law that says you can't discharge this in bankruptcy. So it's just stuck with you for life. A horrible system in the worst way. So student loans is it's why every time anyone asks me about what do we do with the Department of Education, setting aside the big legislative moves that need to happen on school choice, student loans has to get fixed, because this is what is just crippling Americans all over the place, because we federalized it during the Obamacare era, and it's just run amok, and it can only get worse from here unless you fix it right now.
Well, and again, it's a microcosm in another way too, which is the fact that all that money, all that federal money, has all sorts of strings attached to it, right? Has all sorts of it's created an entire administrative class of bureaucrats across higher education, which is part of what's driving the costs up, right?
Yeah.
And when you get rid of the money, you get rid of those strings, and the administrators become superfluous. And and I guess we could say that they would end up self-deporting. I know that's a whole completely different issue set, but it would be kind of like a self-deportation. These people would have to find jobs elsewhere because the work would disappear.
Right.
And the things that the federal government actually does do in education has a legitimate thing in higher education, which is enforcing Title VI, Title IX. You mentioned Title I. Those can be handled by the Department of Justice, because those are actual law enforcement. It's part of federal law. You don't need the Department of Education to do that. That's a Department of Justice issue, not a Department of Education. And if you move it to the Department of Justice, then it becomes a much more formal and transparent criminal procedure, or even civil procedure, than it is in terms of an administrative procedure at the Department of Education. I very much distrust administrative procedures, and I think the Department of Education is one of the worst places for it, especially in terms of due process for
Totally.
Title IX enforcement, right? I mean,
well, and in Title IX enforcement and other acts, I mean, I think that the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights doesn't even have an enforcement mechanism. So they already have to send it over the Department of Justice to, litigate these things, right? And so, again, everything you're saying is totally right, which is there are already mechanisms currently within the federal government that can and should be doing these things, instead of the Department of Education, which is just this shell and this ever-evolving creature of the unions and their interests and the bureaucrats, like you said. And so, again, I think of even Title IX and how the Obama administration and then Biden administration really took it to a totally illegal level, really altered the playing field, essentially, where, you have the results of, boys playing in girls' sports at the end of the day because of their maneuvers. Again, Congress would have to move to kind of, really secure that, to make it, tighter and more restrictive, because otherwise the Department of Education, under a potential future administration that has this distorted view of things, they're just going to really mess with this. So again, get those things, Title IX enforcement, fix that legislatively, get all the things already that the department can't do and isn't really, litigating or, advocating for correctly in the courts. You could just put that over to Department of Justice. You're totally right in the direction that this needs to go, because the more and more that you give Department of Education power or even influence, I mean, the Obama administration on the way out in 2013 and 14, pushing out these dear colleague letters when it came to kind of student discipline issues. The school districts all kind of ran amok when they got the letters, even though it wasn't really a legal letter. They couldn't actually enforce it. They were just kind of putting out these threats there. Huge chilling effect on our school districts. It's why you're seeing, it's why you've seen this kind of huge wave of violence in schools over the last 10 years, frankly, again, just because of a little letter that somebody in the Department of Education writes and that they send out, to the 13,000 or so school districts across the country.
I like to refer to those letters as the nice business you've got there letters.
You're right. Exactly. It's kind of a mafia shakedown tactic or something like that. So
yeah, really, I mean, honestly, that's what it is. Either do this or we're going to come after you.
Right.
And look, that's partly Congress's fault because Congress doesn't specify these things, and they fill these enabling statutes for agencies with all sorts of language of the secretary shall determine or the director shall determine.
Exactly.
And I mean, they're basically outsourcing the process of legislation to unelected bureaucrats. That has to come to an end. And that's not just the Department of Education. It's not a completely different conversation, but it's a much broader conversation about agency law and the role that Congress needs to start playing in self-governance. The whole point of that was elected officials passing laws that are accountable for those laws, and that the executive branch should be executing those things, not creating them and then enforcing them.
Right. And I mean, everything from may and shall, as you said, it then results in these Title IX kangaroo courts that the campuses get to operate, willy-nilly, and they create their own little justice systems in there, utterly just horrible. And both for the outcomes for students, for the wrongly accused. Congress has to fix these things because you put even just a little bit of leeway into the Department of Education and the people that run it and have run it for decades. They're going to, take a mile of, latitude to kind of enforce their political agenda. Terrible for students, terrible for families.
So, Tommy, I mean, we've got a few minutes left here. Why don't you tell us what the AFC is prioritizing?
Absolutely.
For the start of this administration, and hopefully for the 3 months or so that the Department of Education will still exist.
Right.
I'm super optimistic.
Right. Now, the number one thing that we're pushing, and 100% of our focus is going to be about this federal school choice legislation. This will be a federal tax credit for essentially donations to local scholarship groups. So most people are donating to, a scholarship group to help lower income kids. They get a tax deduction. This will essentially change federal tax code law. It will live within Treasury, therefore, and not the Department of Education. This will just be a tax code change that says you now get a dollar for dollar tax credit. So places like New York and California are going to be the huge beneficiaries of this because they don't have state level school choice programs. Right now, we've worked in 31 different states over the years to pass school choice programs at the state level. California and New York, they've resisted this for decades. But if you pass this federally, families in every single state are going to be able to benefit. Even, you can spend the scholarship money that gets donated. You could, how that gets distributed can be up to the parent, essentially. If you want to spend it on, going to a private school or other K through 12 education expenses, even homeschooling expenses, this is all going to be private capital coming off the sidelines, incentivized by the feds to do this. And really, as you talked about in terms of timelines, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts from 2017, that's going to be all, a part of those expirations are going to be renegotiated. You could fit this in there, and therefore it goes in through the reconciliation process because it's just a tax code change. And again, because it's not some big appropriation that has to live within Department of Education, it just is part of Treasury. They just operate this mechanism kind of like they do all the other tax credits out there. It's a good change for, federalism, libertarian instincts, conservative instincts around education. And ultimately, it brings education to the most local level where you're letting parents control their child's education dollars. And again, you're using private capital, not government funds from an appropriations to do it. So that's what we're focused on 100%. The bill that is kind of the main mechanism for this is called the ECCA, just passed through Ways and Means Committee a couple months ago. So it's in pole position to kind of be inserted next year into the kind of the big tax package that's likely to come down.
Well, it'll have to be reintroduced through committee, but it should fly through it now at this point because it's already been pretty much
gone through the hard legs of the process so far. So
right. So it should come out of committee pretty quickly at the start of the new year.
And Trump said on Fox and Friends, on Fox News just a couple weeks before the election, that piece of legislation. He'll sign it if it gets to his desk in 100 days, he said. Speaker Mike Johnson is all in. The Senate will have this sail through, and you only need 51 votes because it's just a tax code change as part of budget reconciliation. So we're incredibly excited, and I bet the teachers unions and Randy Weingarten are not.
I would imagine not. Now, my last question for you is, I'm gonna stick you out on a limb here, Tommy.
Okay.
Are you optimistic that the Department of Education will be unwound in the next 4 years?
I'm incredibly optimistic, right? And you look at the illegal moves that the Biden administration did over the last few years on everything from student loans to Title IX. You look at also, I mean, the FAFSA rollout. The DeVos administration they had a simple mobile app for doing kind of your student loan process, or not your student loan process, but your kind of federal aid process. And then suddenly, day one, Obama team blows that, or the Biden team blows that up. They can't even get the FAFSA, paperwork squared away after 2 or 3 years. It's just been a disaster. A simple federal form to kind of process student aid. They couldn't even handle that. So it's like everything is going to be miles better. And I think parents that had to actually interact with the department, whether you had special needs or you're trying to go through this federal aid process, I think they've all realized this thing is utterly broken. It needs to be done away with. And that's the mandate that Trump's been given, right? He's been campaigning on this, that he wants to end the Department of Education. You and I talked earlier about some of the, first steps, blueprints that you can do just to take it down to the studs. Then Congress, they'll have the ability to act, in the next couple of years to say, hey, we should do away with this, since we've already really neutered its power and kind of put it in other spots that are better able to handle some of these key functions.
Well, Tommy, I want to thank you very much for sitting down and talking with us today.
Of course.
So get some, insight into what's going to probably be the priorities of the incoming administration. Tell us where we can find out more about AFC, about yourself. And before you do, I want to thank our friend, Michelle Blood, who is at Blood Brief on Twitter, for arranging this interview. So Michelle, I know you're watching. Thank you very much. And Tommy, why don't you tell everybody where they can find you?
Sure. Yeah, you can find us on social media, Instagram, Twitter, you name it. At School Choice Now. You can find our website at schoolchoicenow.org. I'm on X, rather, not Twitter, at Tommy_USA. And yeah, keep an eye on things. This is going to be probably in the next 6-7 months. A lot will happen on the education front. That's going to be really exciting for families. And follow us online to stay tuned for more.
It's always Twitter to me.
Twitter X, you call it.
Twitter X.
It's Twitter X. So
always Twitter to me. I'm sorry, right. Elon, just can't hang with the X thing. But it's still the least bubblicious social media platform. CNN was even commenting on this yesterday, which is that it's actually pretty ideologically balanced now, because a bunch of the people are skipping out to Blue Sky. Are you on Blue Sky? I guess I got to ask you this. Are you on Blue Sky yet?
I haven't looked into it yet, but we want to be everywhere. We want to preach the gospel to the nations of sorts, right? So
the Great Commission, there you go. And I'm not going to bother with Blue Sky, but yeah, I think you guys should be over there. You won't last long. They're going to shut you down, but you should try it anyway, just for fun, Tommy. All right, Tommy Schultz, thank you so much for being with us today, and come back and we'll talk more as this unfolds.
Yep, always happy to be on the Department of Ed. Thanks so much for taking the time. It was a lot of fun.
Hey, I'm going to change the title of this podcast. The Department of Ed.
I think you need to. It's good branding.
Tommy, thank you so much.